Thank you very much for the opportunity. I would say that the broad paradigm is very similar. And I would also, borrowing from Professor Ho, like to start with the Belt and Road Initiative as sort of the grand ambition of Xi Jinping to provide these land and sea connectivities, of which the Middle East, as well as the eastern part of the Mediterranean, as well as the Persian Gulf, is a very integral part. So in a sense, what the calculus that China uses in Africa, strategically, financially, as well as conceptually, is very similar to the approach that it is using in the Middle East. And that is the framework I think that it intends to use. What is also interesting is that China's growing interest in the Middle East represents something of a rebalancing from Washington to Beijing, so we can, in a sense, talk about a Middle East pivot to Asia. Now, economic cooperation between China and the Middle East, as with Africa, is very important. It is increasing, particularly with regard to China's energy requirements, particularly with regard to securing its energy future. But the point to make here is that China has maintained a very low profile foreign policy posture towards conflict zones in the region based on its non-interference principle. This essentially has been the leitmotif of its bilateral engagements with countries in Africa, and I think it intends to replicate that within the Middle East situation. As with Africa, there's a primacy and an emphasis on economic issues over political and security issues and concerns. But China, I think, is increasingly starting to grapple with the conundrum of how it can assist with promoting political stability in the region as a key to its role in advancing and promoting economic growth and cooperation. In this regard, it's particularly interesting that in January 2016, China released its Arab policy paper. And that Arab policy paper has very similar components as its China-Africa paper, which was released in 2006. The emphasis and the underpinning philosophy is pragmatic cooperation, which is based on mutual benefit, win-win gains, and so on, with Arab countries, in essence, more or less repeating the broad sort of template that defines China's engagement with developing countries, whether in this region, Africa, or Latin America. Now, as China's global outreach, and I think China is becoming seized with this, insofar as there is increasing tension between its economic engagements and global instability, particularly with regard to terrorism, there is now in the Chinese discourse an increasing focus on political issues, which I think is sort of inevitable. So in this regard, China could promote a kind of dialogue forum which already exists, by the way, in the African Union, namely the African Peace and Security Architecture Partners Forum, which consists of the African Union, the European Union, the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, as well as the EU. And this is based, I think, on three compelling logics. Sort of adds some footnotes to what has been said here. The first is that the US no longer enjoys a monopoly on decisions in the region on the big systemic questions of war and peace. In other words, the Pax Americana is no longer the dominant paradigm as it once was. The second is that Russia's involvement is now indispensable, in my view, to managing and resolving the crisis in the Middle East, and Russia very much wants to be seen as a responsible global actor. And the third is that even though the European Union has been called an invisible superpower it still plays an important role in terms of its economic relations, in terms of its humanitarian support, as well as its institutional partnerships. So in conclusion, I would like to suggest that China's dialogue could be centered around agenda setting with regard to 4 critical themes in the Middle East region. The first concerns borders, migration, and mobility. The second relates to transnational threats. The third is control of weapons of mass destruction and disarmament. And then finally, the trends and challenges that emerge from the energy market. Thank you.